Hi everyone, Mrs. Maxwell here. I get to talk with you today about literary devices, such as alliteration, assonance, allusions, allegories, and analogies. These are only 5 of many other literary devices, which are also called figurative language, but these are the 5 A's I get to focus on today. So with our 5 A's, we've already used alliteration. Other examples are she sells seashells at the seashore, and Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. All these same sounds, these consonant sounds, they're examples of commonly used alliteration. You can click on the little video up here if you want some more explanation about alliteration. I'll give you a second to do that. Okay, and alliteration means what? The commencement of 2 or more words of a word group with the same what? The same. Think for a second. Now, answer. If you said letter or letter sound, you are correct. Now, speechwriters, pastors, and many other teachers use alliteration to help their students remember key points. For example, comparison kills calling. That was in a sermon I listened to last week, and it sticks in my head because of the k sound. So if you want someone to remember a point and you're writing a speech, keep the same sounds for your main points. That's a good tip right there. Okay, assonance is pretty much the same as alliteration, but with vowel sounds. For example, can't pay, won't pay, cheap fares must stay. All the A sticks in your head, and they're stressed so that you can focus on those particular words, okay? So in poetry, like the use of assonance throughout the poem creates a sound of despair. That certain sound of those syllables will make you feel a certain way. So you'll use assonance more in high school and college, but wanted to introduce it to you. Allusions. Now, allusions are my favorite, but every time I start to teach them, my students say, oh, I know what an allusion is. That's like when someone does a magic trick. That is not the same. Allusions are not illusions with an I. So big X on the magic trick, not a magic trick. Allusions are when an author refers to something that's assumed to be common knowledge, such as historical events or widely read literature. For example, many people will say, well, that was kind of a Hitler thing to do, or it's just like a Holocaust, referring to the big 1930s, 40s Holocaust that happened in Germany. They don't have to explain the whole thing. They assume everyone knows it. Or widely read literature, such as Greek mythology or Red Riding Hood or the Bible. People will refer to those stories, or even popular movies like The Wizard of Oz, and they'll assume you already know what they're talking about. They might say, oh, he's just such a cowardly lion, assuming you've seen The Wizard of Oz or read the book, and you know what a cowardly lion is and what they're referring to. So the reason authors use allusions are, well, they're multiple. Sometimes it's just to let you know they're widely read, or to refer you to one of their favorite authors or their favorite books. But 2 of the most common reasons are to make a connection with the reader. If they connect to your culture, then they've got you. They've captured your attention a little bit. Or to convey a big idea. For example, if someone were to say, that was a huge David and Goliath victory, then it's assumed that people know the biblical story of little David fighting Goliath and beating him against all odds. They don't have to explain the big story, but they can explain the concept of the underdog winning without having to really get into it. So these are fun concepts that authors like to use in order to, again, make connection and connect to the culture of that time. Okay, so the most common allusions they use are historical allusions and literary allusions. Several literary allusions are like biblical allusions, classic movie allusions, like I already referenced, The Wizard of Oz, you'll see here on the right, fairy tale allusions, such as Little Red Riding Hood, and Greek mythology allusions. They might say, oh, he was such an Apollo. assuming you'll know he's the Greek god that was so gorgeous. So anyway, if you see those, it's exciting to just point them out to people and to start trying to use them in your own writing. Okay, application. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., sorry, should have put Jr. up here. He uses both historical and biblical allusions in his I Have a Dream speech. He starts out with reference to Lincoln's 7 years ago speech and intersperses several allusions throughout. Most of the allusions he uses are biblical allusions. Other great writers such as Shakespeare, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Dickens, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis with The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, Chesterton, countless others use biblical allusions and other literary allusions to evoke certain emotions and connections in their writing. They want you to feel what they're feeling and to draw deeper connections from those old stories. So when you discover these little allusions in literature, it makes you look smart. You're like, hey, I know that. I know what they're talking about. If you don't know what they're talking about, but you know it's an allusion to something, feel free to look it up. We have this wonderful thing called the internet. You can type in just about anything and find out more information about it. So do it. Then you'll look smart and have your smarticle particles showing as you go to high school and college. People will go, oh, he knows all this stuff. He's well read. One of my students the other day said, hey, I watched this movie and the woman in it referred to Uncle Tom's Cabin and we're reading that. That was so cool. He was all excited because he knew that book and she did the allusion. So anyway, you never know when they might come in handy. Several allegories are also used as literary devices. Now, an allegory is a story, a poem, or a picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. So it adds a layer to your writing. Some examples of allegorical books are, of course, what you see here. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and George Orwell's Animal Farm. The Animal Farm is a political allegory, and Pilgrim's Progress is a spiritual allegory. Another spiritual allegory is the children's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Well, pretty much the whole series. C.S. Lewis compares the lion in the book represents Jesus Christ dying for people's sins. And the witch in the book represents Satan or the devil trying to draw people away into darkness and sin. So it's a fun children's story that has an also deeper kind of hidden meaning. I love to read books like this and try to figure out what the meanings are. So most good stories, especially children's stories, are allegorical because they try to teach a moral or a lesson through the characters, such as Little Red Riding Hood. She is taught not to talk to strangers by having a big consequence happen from the big bad wolf. He eats her and her grandma. That'll teach a kid not to talk to strangers, right? So you can use your allegories in your own writing to convey your deeper message through your characters. And then you don't have to be like all preachy and say, this is what I want you to do, kids. Don't talk to strangers. So, yeah. Finally, number 5, analogies. Analogies are like metaphors. They compare one thing to another. And I just used a simile there, didn't I? Anyway, analogies are lots of fun. The definition is a comparison between two things, typically for the purpose of explanation or clarification, like an analogy between the workings of nature and those of human societies, or the analogy between this heart and this water pump. Oftentimes the two things being compared are pretty much unlike, but they're not like each other, but they're based on a resemblance of a particular aspect. So try to think for a minute, what do these two unlike items have in common? There they are again, the heart and the water pump. Oftentimes students will be asked to complete a written analogy in order to show they understand the relationship between the two objects being compared. For example, this analogy between this red beating heart and this green pump. they'll phrase the analogy like this. Heart is to blood as pump is to fill in the blank. See if you're right. The answer is, if you said water, you are correct. Now be sure to show the same relationships in the analogies as there are in the earlier part of the analogy. A heart pumps blood and the pump pumps water. So blood and water have that same relationship to the word before as each other. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully. Let's try again. Let's practice, okay? So pencil is to lead as pen is to blank. Now you'll see that you can rewrite it with the little colons in there. The first colon means is to, and the second double colon means as. And then you'll have your second comparison after that. So tropical is to hot as polar is to. Exciting is to boring as strange is to. Now here's your challenge one. Medicine is to blank as law is to anarchy. Now anarchy is people going crazy without the law, just so you know. In order to help you on the challenge, law prevents anarchy. So that'll help you for the relation for the first part of the challenge. So as you can see, again, analogies are sometimes expressed with colons, those two dots, and double colons to save words and time, okay? Here are your answers. Pencil is to lead as pen is to ink was correct. And if you put cold, tropical is to hot, polar is to cold, you were correct. Exciting is to boring, as strange is to normal, or a word along those lines. And the challenge was medicine is to illness, or sickness or disease, as law is to anarchy. And again, these little colons mean is to at the beginning, and the double colon means as. So when you're reading it, kind of read it out loud that same way. Analogies are used in literature, math, and science, among many other places. So an example of analogy in literature. A common expression that's an example of an analogy is to let a situation thaw. This analogy compares any difficult situation to a block of ice. To let any situation thaw would mean to let it rest, to give it space. Ice and difficult situation are not similar by nature. However, an analogy compares the two to show the similarities. Ice is a much simpler subject to explain than a trying situation is. Okay, so use analogies in your writing like you would use idioms as expressions to make your point in a unique way. But idioms are a different story for another day. I'm going to make like a treat and leave for now. Adios.